Fresh start here. I'm Stuart Sprague. This is the Anderson Forum for Progressive Theology. We have a group here in Anderson, and we have a group of listeners online with Zoom. And so there are folks from lots of different places participating. We're happy today to have a special guest, Dr. Andrew Root. He is a professor of youth and family ministry at the Luther Seminary. Is it Minneapolis or St. Paul?
Well, it doesn't really matter, but for us, it's St. Paul.
St. Paul, okay.
Minneapolis people are smoothies.
I understand. There's a river between you.
There's a
On one side of the river, it's a little different than the other.
That's right.
Okay. Well, he has a PhD degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. He brings great credentials to that post. He is a widely published author. I don't know exactly how many books, a number of books, many devoted particularly to the role of the church in the secular age as he describes it. So we're happy to have him come and speak to us. His topic today will be doing theology in a secular age. And I'm quite interested in that subject, so I look forward to what you have to say to us. So if you'll come and get started, we'll proceed.
All right.
We'll have time for questions and answers after he's finished his initial presentation.
Well, thank you all, and I am going to do my best to make sure we have enough time for engagement, but I do have a bit of a tour de force for you. So I'm gonna take you through and tell you quite a long story about how we got to this point, and I hope it's quite a relevant one. And I have just a big why question to frame our conversation, which builds off what Stuart just said, and this why it feels so hard for the church to be the church today. Why does it just feel so hard for the church to be the church? So I always find it quite annoying when people give a question and then you have to wait an hour to answer it. So we're just going to answer this question right now. And the reason I think that this is true is because of the secular. So that's it. I guess we don't have a tour de force. We're done. Q&A time. All right. So here's the problem. I think you probably feel this. To say anything is the secular, or even to start a conversation about how the secular is impacting Protestantism, or how it's impacting society, or how it's impacting your particular congregation or denomination, it doesn't take too much thinking to realize that the secular is a very complicated word. And just in a conversation with someone, you can start to realize the way you're defining the secular and the way they're defining the secular are quite different. The secular is a slippery word, and it's also a very multivalent word. It seems to have multiple dimensions to it. So what I want to do with this hour is try to unfold what we actually mean when we say the secular. And I think there's a lot at stake here, because I think if we get our definitions wrong, even out of our best intentions, those of us within the church who are trying to witness to the world and be a blessing to the world, we may actually make matters worse with the wrong definition of the secular. So let me start by telling you this story. I told you it was going to be a story. So the pastor of this congregation, Austin, is here. And I asked Austin to get the time machine available for us so we could all go back in time. But he said, just like this projector that needs a new bulb, so the time machine needs a new flux capacitor for your Back to the Future fans. Thank you for getting that joke. So we're going to have to do this in our minds. We actually can't go 88 miles an hour outside this street. So we're going to just have to do this in our imaginations. So I want to take you back in time. And I want to tell you this historical story, but I want you to also think of it as more than just a historical story, but also how people's imaginations change. This is really a conversation about imagination. So let's go back in time and let's leave North America and let's go somewhere exotic. Let's go to Paris and let's walk the Latin Quarter of Paris in the 14th century. If we were to walk the Latin Quarter of Paris in the 14th century, we would be walking in a society where there was no secular. That if there was a dial of the secular, it would be set at 0. Now, people weren't ignorant or stupid. They knew, for instance, if they went to the cathedral and the priest was giving the Eucharist, the chalice of which the priest poured the Eucharist, that was a holy thing. They knew that. They knew that that was sacred. They also knew that their shovel or hoe that they used on their field was a profane thing. And by profane, I don't mean bad or gross or despicable. I simply mean not used in holy activity. People knew the difference of those things, but all of that stuff seemed to fit together in a kind of one whole cloth or a perfect puzzle where the pieces just click together. As a matter of fact, if you live in a secular zero world, it's nearly impossible not to believe. It's hard not to believe. Everything just perpetuates a sense of belief. So it's really hard not to. As a matter of fact, we don't really have a word for it. We don't really have a word for an atheist until much into the 17th, 18th century. Now, that's not to say you couldn't be an atheist, but it was very rare and very difficult to actually pull off. As a matter of fact, this is a statue that's in Venice, Italy. You can find it today. You go to Venice, Italy, you can find this right off the Grand Canal. And this is a statue of a man, I'm sure maybe some of you know, maybe some of you don't. This is a man by the name of Paolo Sarpi. I don't know if you know the name Paolo Sarpi. What he's famous for is really two things. One, he's famous for being the dissenting voice at the Council of Trent. If that doesn't make you boring, bored, I don't know what will. But more interestingly, and maybe more infamous, that Sarpi is known as Galileo's friend. He's Galileo's friend who encourages him to write his book that gets him in hot water with the Jesuits in the Catholic Church for saying that the earth moves around the sun, not the sun around the earth. Now, like I said, you can find this statue today and go discover it, and you will see that it sits on a pedestal, and on that pedestal is a plaque, and it will say Paolo Sarpi, date of birth, date of death, and then there will be a quote in Italian. And so if you speak Italian, you're in luck. If you don't speak Italian, you can find a hunky Italian man to translate it for you. It's the perfect pickup line if you need one, so you're welcome. But this is what this Italian quote says. It says, Paolo Sarpi, the only unbeliever of his generation. That's a remarkable quote. And we're not even talking 14th century. I'm taking you back to the 14th century. We're talking early 16th century. If you die in the early 16th century and you don't believe, you get a statue. I mean, that's remarkable. I don't know. I know if you go down 2 hours to Atlanta, the traffic is pretty bad in Atlanta, but it'd be worse if they had to have a statue for every non-believer in Atlanta. You know, they'd have to put them on the freeways to get them all there. But in this time, in the secular zero time, it's very hard not to believe. It's nearly impossible not to believe. I only know one thought experiment that has tried to imagine what it would be like to be us, late modern people, and then therefore go all the way back to secular zero. I only know one thought experiment that's tried it, and it is just releasing its 6th season on Hulu. It's a novel turned into a TV series called The Handmaid's Tale. Has anyone seen The Handmaid's Tale? Okay, if you want something to do and therefore not sleep for the next few weeks, watch The Handmaid's Tale because you will be captivated. It's great storytelling, but it also is frightening. I mean, it is in the genre of dystopia, and it is dystopia. Many of you know this already, that they're based off the TV show, the 6 seasons. They go beyond this, but they're based off a novel written by a Canadian author named Margaret Atwood, who in the mid-1980s imagined in this novel that America had fallen, that America no longer exists. And this is where the TV series picks it up, that a far right-wing group has taken over America, and they have turned back the clock to secular zero. They call themselves now Gilead, and they run this part of the world, and it really is secular zero. One of the most haunting things as you watch the first season is the way you talk, the way you dress. It all is filed under this sense of belief. For instance, you have to, in public discourse, you have to reenact the liturgy. You have to go, these women go to the supermarket and they say, under his eye, may the Lord open. If they don't enact the liturgy, even in the public space, they get punished. The way you stand before God, you dress like that. Your very dress in public society signals where you stand before God. So this whole sense of going back to secular zero. Now, I talked to a lot of bishops and seminary presidents and other people who are running institutions in Protestantism, and everyone's worried about the future of their institution. Everyone's worried about the future of the church. No one has ever said to me, You know what we're going for in our synod? You know what we're going for in our district? Handmaid's Tale. That's what we're going for. No one has ever said that to me because I think it's an absolute nightmare. It's an absolute dystopian nightmare to imagine you could be late modern like we are and go all the way back to this secular zero world. The reason they think it's a nightmare, and Atwood thinks it's a nightmare too, she thinks it's an absolute nightmare that this could happen. And I think she thinks that is because you have to have at least three things to live in a secular zero world. And these three things you need to have is, first of all, you need a deep sense that the world is an enchanted place. And by that I mean that there are devils and there are demons everywhere, that there are angels at work, and that they are doing things, and that you could encounter them in the woods, or they could impact the way your children behave, that there are these enchanted realities everywhere. Connected to that, and because there's enchanted realities everywhere, things that you can touch and feel can either be imbued with a divine force or an evil force. And the way that that works is the closer you get to those things, say touch those things, or are around those things, their evil force or their divine force, holy force, could radiate into your own being. So not only are things imbued with a divine force, but the self is quite porous. And if you get close to those holy things, they will come into your being. I mean, I've taken you to the streets of Paris already, and we forget that Notre Dame and Chapelle, the two beautiful buildings on the island in the middle of Paris, they are both built as reliquaries. They are built because King Louis, has Jesus' crown of thorns. That's why they built Notre Dame, because Jesus' crown of thorns, that beautiful building, is supposed to house that holy thing. I don't know if you need to do a capital campaign at your church, but try that next time. Say, we need a new wing on our church because we have James's ankle bone. That's why we need a $10 million addition on the church, because we have James's ankle bone. Let's go for it. My guess is your church council will not approve that plan. That's very much the imagination of a secular zero person. So let me tell you one story that weaves all three of these together. And it comes from the high medieval period, and it's written in a book by Keith Thomas in this book called Religion and the Decline of Magic. He's an Oxford historian, and he tells this story. You can hear where he's going with this, Religion and the Decline of Magic. He's talking about the high medieval period. There's a big church controversy. And the controversy was that they were getting intel, the priests and the bishops and the cardinals were getting intel that people were going to the cathedral to take the Eucharist. The host was put on their tongue, and then they were holding the host in their mouth and not swallowing it. Then they were leaving the church, leaving the cathedral. They were going home. They were taking the host out. They were feeding it to their sick pig. They were putting it on their fields, not because they were denigrating it, but because they believed it was imbued with magical powers, that it was imbued with the very flesh of Jesus Christ. And if you needed that pig to survive so your kids could live through the winter, why not? If you need a better crop yield this year than last year, where you almost all starved to death, why not put a little bit of Jesus' flesh in the ground? Well, you can imagine that this made the priests, the cardinals, the bishops very, very upset. So they called a meeting and they sent out an advertisement. I don't know if it was an email or what it was. They sent out an advertisement and said, this year at the forum on Sunday, what we are going to talk about is how to get people to swallow the host. And people were like, oh my gosh, that sounds like the most relevant thing I could imagine. I'm willing to walk for 3 days to go to that. So they gathered, and that was the big question. How do we get people to swallow the host? And some genius in the room raised his hand, and they called on him, and he stood up and he said, well, I have an idea. How about we make people stick out their tongues and show us that they've swallowed it? Now, you've seen this. If you've watched any Italian gangster movie or Irish gangster movie, you know there's always this Scorsese-esque scene where the mob boss or the mob boss trying to take control, he's going to kill all his enemies at the same day it's his daughter's first communion. And you get this symbolism of spilled blood and spilled blood. But you see it, the mob boss goes forward, hands would go behind back at the railing. Priest, only one who can touch the host, puts it on mob boss's tongue while all his enemies in the montages are dying, and he swallows it and shows the priest, like a 4-year-old with a sore throat at the doctor's office, that they've swallowed the host. This goes all the way back to the high medieval period, at least in some Catholic communities. Well, the other thing they needed to do was ramp up the rhetoric. They left that meeting saying, let's have people stick out their tongues, but let's also remind them that if they misuse the host, it's the most holy thing we have in all of Christendom, and if you misuse it, you will burn in hell forever. So they did. And we're told that for the next 100 years, it became church law that you had to take communion twice a year. And most people took it twice a year. They were absolutely frightened of it. What would happen when this very holy thing would touch their sinful tongues? But it was better than the alternative, which is if you didn't take communion, you would surely burn in hell forever. So you would do it. So even over and against your fear, you would take it twice a year. So I've been telling Austin, who's hosted my wife and I this weekend, that our son is a 20-year-old at Seton Hall University. And he's a great kid, wonderful kid. And I know this is going over Zoom right now, so I want to say this very, very clearly. Great kid. Die for this kid. But between like 11 and 17, incredible pain in the ass. I'm sorry. I mean, just like biggest contrarian who would ever exist. Like I could say the sky is blue and he'd argue against it. Like this boy, he did not think anything I ever said was worth the air that had said it. Like this is just how it was for 6-7 years with this kid. Well, in our church in South Minneapolis, that Cara, my wife, is a pastor of, when we take communion, we take it in a circle. We have this beautiful experience of being able to take it in a circle. We're a small enough congregation that everyone can stand up, and we stand in a circle. Words of institution go over the elements. Basket of bread is passed. Cup follows it. And you have this beautiful moment where you turn to the person next to you, look them in the eyes, and give them the elements. Quite beautiful. Well, this particular Sunday, my son, probably 15 at the time, is standing next to me, and the basket of bread starts getting passed kind of counterclockwise. We're at 6 o'clock, bread starting at 12 o'clock, coming counterclockwise. And he turns to me as it's passed, and he says in a kind of stage whisper, he goes, "Hey, is that bread? Is that bread gluten-free? Is that gluten-free bread?" And you need to know this boy hates everything gluten-free. He's opposed to gluten-free. He hates everything about it. He doesn't think it tastes good. He thinks the texture is awful. He thinks the whole thing about gluten-free is a scam. I don't know from who. Big bread, I guess. I don't know where this comes from, but he hates it. And he hates it for all those reasons. But really he hates it because for a long time his mother was gluten-free and was doing all gluten-free stuff. So he absolutely hated it. So I knew this was going to be a problem. So he says, "Is that bread gluten-free?" And I just say, "Yeah, yeah, don't even look at him." And then this is what this kid does. In a louder stage whisper, he goes to me, "Well, then I'm out." And he turns around and he walks out of church. Now, I have to tell you, people, and I know this is being at least streamed, if not recorded, so I say this as a confession to you. It took everything in me to not tackle the boy and beat him in front of the church that day. But just think of this complete different imagination. The high medieval person going to the altar, shaking of what will happen when this holy thing touches their tongue, to my 15-year-old son being like, gluten-free, I don't care for the texture, and this will really annoy my mom, so I'm out. Very different kind of imagination. I'm not quite so sure we have this same kind of sense of enchantment of things being imbued with the divine force and the self being porous. We have a very different kind of imagination. Now, what happens, or what the church provides, and even the pastor or the lay leadership, if you want to go there, provides in a secular zero world, is really this deep sense of access. How do we give people access out of the demonic into the holy? How do we give them access to the sacrament? How do we give them access to the holy things? It really becomes about access. Now, what I want you to see is we're trying to define what the secular is. And whatever the secular is, whatever it is, it comes out of the backdrop of this kind of world. This kind of world where it was nearly impossible to function in this world and not believe. It just seemed quite obvious to everyone that God was doing things in the world and that God was moving in the world. And it was hard even to function in society outside of constructs of belief. It was nearly impossible. So whatever the secular is, as we experience it in the West, it comes out of this reality where it was almost nearly impossible not to believe. But things change, and things start to change somewhere in the 17th, 18th century. Things start changing, really take off and change in the 19th century. And we still experience these realities, and they start to change with what we could call secular one. So whatever the secular is, it arrives first as what we'll call secular one. And this arrives as this incredibly powerful reality that we almost don't even notice because it's just so ingrained in how we think of ourselves and think of the world. And it arrives with this bifurcating between what is public and what is private. Now, I want you to think about it like this. Go back, and I'm sure, particularly in the South, this won't be hard because there's somebody and you're growing up who told you that when you go to a dinner party, there are 4 topics you should never talk about at a dinner party. I'm sure you had an aunt or a grandmother or a neighbor or somebody who told you, when you go to a dinner party, never go up to somebody and say, "Oh, nice to meet you. How much money do you make?" It'd be very rude to do that. Don't ever talk about money. The second thing you were not supposed to talk about, if you remember, is you were not supposed to talk about politics. Don't talk about politics. Now that's hard in our day and age because politics has become entertainment. So you're kind of like, what else do you talk about except politics? But you were not supposed to talk about politics. The third thing you're not supposed to talk about, I think, is held on. If you're at a dinner party, do not talk about sex. It would be very rude to go up to someone you're just meeting, shake their hand, introduce yourself, and then say, "Well, just tell me a little bit about your sex life." I mean, it'd be very, very rude. You'd be at a really weird party. Don't do that. And then the fourth thing, if you remember, that you were told you should not talk about is religion. So there it is. The 4 topics you're not supposed to talk about at a dinner party: money, politics, sex, and religion. Why? Well, the reason why is it's presumed that those 4 things are private. And polite people do not talk about private things in public. This is an amazing change in our imagination when belief becomes a private reality. Anyone in secular zero would never presume. They didn't even have a sense of what the private was. We now have this deep sense that there's a public space and a private space. And the secular arrives when belief itself is presumed to be a private thing. This changes things deeply. It presumes that the church itself is a public institution where people who have private beliefs come and express or demonstrate those private beliefs in public. And who a pastor is a public person who impacts people's private beliefs by their sermons or by leading a Bible study or a prayer group. And then the church becomes the place where you come and demonstrate the way the pastor has helped you cross the boundary between what is public and private and helps you come and demonstrate that within the church. So it takes the form. It replaces the enchantment and the things in the self-made chorus, and what becomes significant is wills. Wills become very important. And it's not just purely rational, but it's now decided, because belief becomes a private thing, that somehow you decide this, or you figure this out, or you feel it. What it means to believe is that you come to know it. You can hear the echoes of the Protestant Reformation here, where Luther says, "Here I stand, I can do no other." That by my will, I cannot act over and against my will of what it believes, what it means for me to believe. So what you replace, the things disappear, and what you get instead is this sense of will. What will you willfully enact? What do you willfully hold to? How will you willfully demonstrate that? Now, let me illustrate this. We're going to try this. I have a speaker here. I'm going to try to play a video clip for you, and I'm going to hope that it's loud enough. But I want to show you a video clip, and it does have closed captions, so you'll be able to read it if you can't hear it well. This was, remember when this happened? It's hard to remember this because it happened right after the pandemic. It's hard to remember. It was right before the pandemic, excuse me. It's hard to remember anything that happened before the pandemic. But remember when we got word midday in the States that Notre Dame in Paris was on fire? Remember it? It's one of the most annoying days in all of social media. And there have been a lot of those annoying days. But this one was really annoying because everyone had to post their picture of themselves at Notre Dame. It was a way to flex that you had been to Paris. Or like, we get it. You were in Paris 25 years ago when you studied abroad. Congratulations. But this is the news story on the PBS NewsHour the evening that this occurred. So I want you to listen to this. And they're going to interview the woman who is the dean of the American Episcopal Chapel in Paris or something. And I just want you to listen to how she talks about this. So we'll see if we can get the volume to work here.
American Cathedral in Paris.
It's brought out in all of us how much we care, not just about the building, which is gorgeous and historic, but about what it stands for. Paris, France, Europe, the world, tradition, Christian faith at its finest. Christian faith that endures.
The dean is grateful that so many relics survive.
The relics are important, whether or not it really was Jesus' crown of thorns, for instance. Who knows? What's important is that it was a focus of faith, a focus of people's prayers for hundreds of years. So the things themselves are not so important as what they stand for, what they mean to people, the faith they evoke.
At present, the precise.
All right. So you can hear it. I think you could hear. Could you hear it in the back? You could hear it okay? But you can hear what she's saying then. If you could hear it, you can hopefully hear the point I'm trying to make here. It's almost as if I paid her to say that. She illustrates this point beautifully. She says, and this is not actually to be critical of her. She may be exactly right, and I would have answered the exact same way, but you can see a very different imagination in Secular Zero. She says, first of all, was it really Jesus' crown of thorns? I mean, was it really, really Jesus' crown of thorns? I mean, was it truly, truly the very crown of thorns that was on Jesus' head? I mean, first of all, that's a very modern question. No medieval person, no ancient person would ever really ask that question. Was it really, really? Was it really, truly? I mean, that's a certain perspective on reality to ask. Could we run a DNA test on it? How do we know it really, really was? But then she says, doesn't really matter. Doesn't really matter if it was Jesus' crown of thorns or not, because what matters is that faith invoked in people, that people prayed with it, that it did something within people, that it turned people's hearts towards God or led people into praying. So you can see the gravity shifts from what is out there, the thing itself, to what is in here. It matters because it led people to pray in a certain way. So the thing isn't as important as the will. To give you another story that illustrates this, I remember from my growing up, this is a very sad thing to confess, but I remember one sermon from all of my whole growing up, my childhood, adolescence. I remember one sermon. It's both probably because my mind was warped by the reruns of The Brady Bunch and Gilligan's Island that I watched nonstop. That's probably one reason. The other reason, maybe, I hate to say this, but maybe my pastor wasn't a great preacher, because really all he ever preached, he was a classic Lutheran guy. He preached Paul's epistles over and over and over again. And I think the one sermon I remember was the one time he went off script and did not preach a Pauline Lutheran sermon, but he preached a Jonathan Edwards sermon, which is a very odd thing for a conservative Lutheran to do, to preach a Reformed Puritan kind of sermon. But I remember it vividly. Can you remember where I was sitting in the sanctuary? And I remember the refrain of the sermon. This was the refrain of the sermon. If you waste time, you steal from God. If you waste time, you steal from God. I remember saying it, I couldn't believe it. I was sitting in a corner and I kept running that refrain over and over in my mind. If you waste time, you steal from God. If you waste time, you steal from God. I thought to myself, that's unbelievable. And then I thought to myself, I'm in 5th grade. That's what I thought. And I thought, I've been going to school for 6 years. I go to school from 8:30 in the morning to 3:30 in the afternoon. I hate school. I hate everything about school. What I have done over these 6 years has honed my time-wasting skills. I have become a time-wasting savant. I have a whole organized time-wasting plan. I smuggle magazines into class and read them secretly. I pass notes. I have a whole plan of how I'm going to daydream throughout the day. Anything I can do to not pay attention and make the day go faster is what I do. And now my pastor was saying, if you waste time, you steal from God. I couldn't believe it. He preached that sermon, and then he just went back to Paul's epistles. He never preached another one. But this was a kind of classic reformed kind of sermon that he was embodying. And what happens at the beginning of this period is to focus on the wills is not to lower the bar of commitment. It's actually to heighten it. We all now are priests, and we all have to turn our hearts to God and read the scriptures, and we have to pay attention of our inner lives at all time. We actually have historical documentation of this, of Puritan women who came to this land, and they would keep time journals of every second of every day to make sure that their hearts were turned towards God. So you see the weight, the gravity isn't to lower the bar, it's to heighten the bar of commitment, but the emphasis goes from what is external to what is internal. And this becomes a major building block of what the secular is. The second point here is we move from living in a cosmos to living in a universe. And to illustrate this, some of you will remember this, January 31st, 2018, again, before the pandemic, so it's hard to remember anything. It's just different every place in the country, but remember we did have a full eclipse not too long ago, but this was the date of the super red blood moon. One of my favorite things to do with a room full of, say, 100 pastors is to say, you all remember this date, and you remember it well. Because you remember a week before this and a week after this, you were never more busy. I mean, the amount of pastoral care calls you did in that 2 weeks, it surpassed all of them you would do in 5 years. Remember that? Remember how busy you all were? And it's really fun because they all start getting very anxious and looking around like, I don't remember that. I wasn't busy. Were you? And they start thinking, what's wrong with me? Well, why weren't we busy? And of course, no one was busy. Again, this was the time of the super red blood moon. But you could imagine in a different imaginary, in a different way of imagining ourselves in the world, you could imagine that the pastor gets all sorts of calls and the people say, Pastor, we need to talk. I hear there's going to be a super red blood moon. I just interviewed for a job in Chicago, and if I take it, I got to move the family to Chicago, but now there's a super red blood moon. Does God want me to take the job, or does God not want me to take the job? Or, Pastor, we're trying to have a baby, but now there's a super red blood moon. Is it safe to have a baby, or is it not safe to have a baby? No one, I would guess, no one did any pastoral care calls like that during this time. It didn't matter. And part of the reason for that is we shifted from living in a cosmos to living in a universe. When you live in a cosmos, even the natural phenomenon has a message. There's a story in it, and you need someone to interpret it. What does it mean? What is the bigger story here? Which great leader is going to die because that comet is in the sky? What does this mean? How do we prepare for this? What is going on? But what happens for us and becomes a major element of a secular age is we tend not to think that natural phenomena, say it boldly, means anything. Doesn't mean anything. This super red blood moon doesn't mean anything. Now, that's not to say it isn't beautiful, it isn't wonderful. It doesn't mean that you should get out there and Instagram yourself with it. You totally should. And it's not even to say that you couldn't get up at 5 in the morning and Instagram yourself with it, or just see it and think to yourself, oh my gosh, this is incredibly beautiful. It does remind me that there is a creator in the world, or there is a great spirit moving the world somewhere. It may do that, but the person standing next to you means nothing to them. They're like, oh, it's cool, I guess, but it doesn't mean anything. So if it's going to mean something, even the natural phenomenon, even looking at those mountains and being awoken by them, it has to be done inside of you. So in a cosmos, we even think the natural phenomenon has a message, and someone needs to interpret. It's part of the larger story of where God is moving the world. Well, when you live in the universe, I mean, again, nice, but we know what this is. I mean, we have mathematical equations that will tell us when the next one will come. So if it impacts you, then you see it, and it awakens some kind of sense of beauty or awe in you, that's great. But it's nothing objective. It doesn't mean anything to the next person who sees it. It may impact you internally, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything out there. It says anything about history. And so you can see this very different way we start to make sense of this reality. So we can say that in secular one, the emphasis moves from access to demonstrate. And I think I've already said this enough, but the idea is that the church is the place where people demonstrate what they internally believe. They come and publicly articulate that their internal sense of belief, they demonstrate externally. And so the best pastor becomes, in some sense, the civic pastor who helps people demonstrate what they believe internally. Now, one of the very important points here that I want you to see is a lot of the thinkers I'm building off to give you this quick story on how belief changes are political philosophers. And one of the elements that they'll raise here is that what occurs in this kind of secular age is we start to presume, for instance, the people who are our leaders, the people who are in charge of our society, that we start to presume in the public-private reality that we actually don't really care what they believe. Like the mayor. Do we really care if the mayor believes in the Nicene Creed? Do we think I would never vote for anyone who does not believe in the Nicene Creed or doesn't have an Augustinian sense of ontology? No, we tend to not care what the mayor believes. But what we do care is the garbage gets picked up, that the water is clean. But in a secular zero reality, if we find out the dukes, the king, the queen, if they're doing witchcraft, if they don't believe in the true teaching of the church, we're all screwed. I mean, we are all in big trouble. So you see how this imagination starts to shift, where we start to think what one does publicly, what you do as a public official, we don't really care what you believe internally. You can see this creates problems, but it also maybe creates possibilities. It also means you could have a society that people believe different things in it. I mean, you remember, it's not that long that we've had societies, even in the West, where people could live in it and we could have a truly plural society. That was very rare. I mean, France could pull it off. England could pull it off. Even as late as the 17th century could not pull this off. I mean, there were battles and fights and killing between Catholics and Protestants for a long time. But part of what arrives is this public-private reality. Now, where this clicks forward to us, and I think we'll probably feel really quite pointedly, is that this clicks forward to what we might shockingly call secular two. And what happens in secular two is this public-private divide gets a bit radicalized, and we start to feel like there is a collision, there's even a fight, if you will, between religious space and a religious space. So secular two, if we were to define it, we would define secular two as really the way the media always defines the secular. So the way most denominations define the secular, we would define it as fewer and fewer people are going to church. Our religious institutions are weaker and weaker. In other words, fewer and fewer people are participating. And so it seems like the a-religious space, say like youth sports, is growing. And religious space, like getting your kids to Sunday school or to midweek Bible study, is shrinking. And we start to feel like a good church, the good church, we'll put that quotes, the good church is the one that can win a little bit more space for the religious over the a-religious. So how can we get more people to participate? How can we get more people to make that decision, the private decision, to publicly come and participate? So it does click forward to this sense from demonstrate to participate. And we start to think the best churches that are doing the best in our cultural context are able to win people's participation. So I have a former student who's a friend now, and is a pastor of a pretty mid-sized to large church in Minneapolis. And he called me and said that he had done a terrible thing. something that I would recommend you never do. This terrible thing that he did is that he Googled his church. Don't ever Google your church, because he Googled his church and he discovered that his church had like 8 Google reviews. I don't know if you know this, but basically Google allows you to review anything in the world. If we wanted to, someone could go on right now and Google review this bench. I mean, this stool here. You can Google review just about anything. And so to his shock, his church had 8 Google reviews, and he decided to do the worst thing. Don't ever do this. He decided to read those Google reviews, and he thought he could get away with it because he had 4.8 stars out of 5. And thought, I could use some affirmation today. So he starts reading these, and they are all really positive. But after he gets through about 3 or 4, he starts getting this very dreaded and kind of sinking feeling. And because they all say things like, "We love this church. This church is great. The carpets are always clean at this church." And then the second one said, "We love this church. We feel very safe putting our children in the nursery. This church is committed to sanitizing all the nursery toys once a quarter." Third one said, "We love this church. The preaching is above average. It's worth our 25-minute drive." And on they went. And he said what he started to realize is they were all written in the exact same format as an Airbnb review. They were all about the amenities. What did you get out of this? How clean was it? What accesses did it give you? And this becomes the deep temptation, is that if we think what it means to live in a secular age, we think the way we should respond to the secular is we have to find some way to win participation. We have to get more people to come. We have to find some way to make religion relevant to people, and that we're in a fight for people's time, people's money, people's participation. Now, I get it. If you oversee a budget or you're a lay leader at your church and you're aware that, well, it really is true. Most churches in America are one roof leak away from never being able to recover. So this is a big deal. And if you're the one who has to pay the nursery workers, 10-hour-a-week money so she can go to college, you want to make sure she can get paid. But I do think that this is actually the red herring. I'm not sure that what it means to live in a secular age is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. Again, this is how the way almost everyone defines it, but I'm not sure that this is actually what it means to live in a secular age. So what it means to live in a secular age, I think, and how we should define the secular is by secular 3. No, you're shocked that secular 3 follows secular 2, but by secular 3. All right, so I have a lot of seculars in your mind now. We have 4 at play here. So what is secular 3? Now, secular 2 is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. And I said that's an issue, but let's not think that that's our main issue. Secular 1 is that there's a divide between public and private. What is secular 3? Secular 3 is the reality of all belief becoming contested. Or another way of saying that I find a bit more provocative and poetic is that all belief becomes fragile. It becomes fragilized. That we live in a time where all belief is fragilized. To inhabit a secular age means that we are aware, whether we're explicitly aware or more implicitly aware, but we are aware that there are people in our lives who believe something very different than us, and they seem to be doing okay. Like the neighbor across the street believes something very different than you do, and they get their garbage cans in right after the garbage man comes. It takes you 3 days. Or they go to all their kids' soccer games, and you do your best to at least miss a few of them. We're aware that there are people who believe very different things than us and seem to be doing okay. Or we're also very aware, at least for most people in our churches, maybe not our clergy, but most people in our churches, that they could stop believing what they're believing and keep their jobs. That you can still sell insurance and not believe what you believe. This is the fragilization of belief. Now, this fragilization, to define this, has both a plus and a minus to it, a kind of positive and a negative. But I don't want you to think of this pejoratively, like there's a good thing and there's a bad thing. I want you to think of it like a battery in a remote, where it has both the positive charge, the negative charge, and you need both those charges to get it to move. That's all I know about electrical engineering right there, is that you have to have the plus on the battery lined up where the plus is on the remote. That's all I know. But it fits this, I think, well. The negative, the minus in this secular 3 is that, call it transcendence, or a sense that there is a divine actor in the world, becomes more and more unbelievable to people. And not even as a statement of confession, that people start confessing that they don't believe. As a matter of fact, when you call people up in a sociological report or send them an email link for a survey, still overwhelmingly, at least in America, most people say they believe in God. Most people overwhelmingly still think that they believe in heaven and hell. I mean, it's amazing how many people in a kind of an empirical, quantitative study will say that. But the context of this cultural reality means you can also, not even as a statement of belief, just forget that there is a God moving within history. And then you could be at a coffee shop and you could overhear someone say something like, I was going to that other church across town for a while and it was good, but then things just really got weird, so I stopped going. And you know what I think? I just think I need to take a break from God for a while. And you can hear the person across the table go, I get that. I get that. And you're even listening in. And maybe you're even a lady leader at your church, or you're the pastor, and you're like, I understand how that could go. I totally understand that. I mean, the fact that we think it is a logical thing that you could take a break from God for a while means we live in a very different imagination than our ancestors. To say to a secular 0 person, I'm going to take a break from God for a while, would have been like saying, I'm going to take a break from breathing for a while. I just would like to take a break from breathing for a while. It's not possible in their imagination, but for us, it is quite possible that we all could take a vacation from God for a while. This is the kind of context of this kind of secular age, where we can just kind of forget about God and move on with our lives. So that's the negative reality, that divine action or the transcendent or something becomes more and more unbelievable to people. The positive element, however, is that people feel an incredible intensity, an incredible drive, that they have to construct meaning, that they have to find purpose for themselves, that they are on the hunt to find some kind of significant way to live their lives. It's the kind of secular age that is a surplus of spiritualities. Almost everyone we meet, especially any younger person, they all want to be spiritual. And they feel like they need to be spiritual because it is on them, it is on their own back that they have to find meaning and purpose for themselves. And finding a little spirituality, having some spirituality will help you do that, give a little texture to that reality. So the very kind of context of secular 3, the fragilization takes the form both of God or divine action becoming more and more unbelievable, and yet feeling this urge, this necessity to create meaning for ourselves. Now, most of this talk that I've been giving you, I've been really drawing on a Quebec Canadian philosopher, maybe one of our greatest still living philosophers, a man by the name of Charles Taylor, who in 2007 wrote this incredibly thick book. Maybe some of you have heard of him. Wrote this incredibly thick book, incredibly important book. I tell my students it's the first book written in the 21st century that I think will be read in the 22nd century. I think it's that important of a philosophical book, and it is just called A Secular Age. And it is the perfect book to keep your door open on a very windy day. I mean, it is a thick book, 770-page book. Now, the crazy thing about this book are a few things. One is 770 pages, he only wants to answer one question. One question with 770 pages. And the question he wants to answer is basically the question I've just laid out to you, is why? If you think about just the West. And so he's not only wants to answer one question, he wants to just answer for one part of the world. He's not even saying globally. He's just saying the leftovers of Latin Christendom. Those of us who trace our histories back to the Western Latin Church. So Western Europe, North America, South America. Why in these societies, in the year 1500, short 500 years ago, was it nearly impossible not to believe in God? You couldn't really function in these societies and not believe in God. And yet in a short 500 years, it completely flipped. And in most of the societies across the West, it's easier to not believe in God than to believe in God. What's happened? Now, that may be more nuanced and weird in America, but that is definitely true in France. Definitely true in the Scandinavian countries. Definitely true in the UK. This is what has happened. So 770 pages just to answer that. To drop even worse news on you, you pretty much have to read it 3 or 4 times before it starts really making sense. So that really makes you a bit nauseous. But some of us keep reading it 3 and 4 and 5 and 8 and 10 times because he says some really interesting things. For instance, he says that the way this fragilization works is it's a two-way fragilization. It's a two-way fragilization. So he says it works like this. If you're someone who believes, and he would count himself as that, as a committed Catholic, says you can't help it. You can't help it. Inhabiting this kind of secular age, if you're someone who believes, you can't help it. You are going to have moments where you feel your faith fragilized, where you're going to think to yourself, is this true? Or is this just the family I grew up in? I mean, if I were to grow up with a different family somewhere else in the world, would I believe this? No, I believe it, I believe it, I believe it. You go on. And then you get fragilized again. And you think, religion, is it true? Or is this all just an evolutionary trick? I mean, is this all just false pattern recognition all the way down? No, I believe it, I believe it, I believe it. And you go on. You can't help it. If you're someone who believes in the conditions of this kind of secular age, you will have moments where your belief is fragilized. But what's fascinating, he says, it works the other way as well. He says, let's say you're a young adult. You went to some elite school, I don't know, like Duke or something, and then you moved down to Charleston and you're, working on your band and you're working on an app and you've been to a bunch of different elite schools and you read, and come on, religion, get over yourself. All religion is a historical reality that justifies powerful people keeping other people down. And when you die, you go to heaven. Come on. Get over yourself. Your life is like a TV set that's on. And when you die, unplug, blank, off, done. That's what happens. What you believe is that you don't believe. Taylor's point is in this kind of secular age, you too will have an experience of fragilization. You will have moments when you find your unbelief fragilized and you have moments of believing. For instance, your sister says, you have to come hear your nephew's Christmas concert. You don't want to do it, but you go just to keep her happy. You sit in the back of the concert hall. You're just there, just as the lights dim, you wave to your sister so she knows you've come and she'll be off your back. But you sit there and the lights go down and it starts. It's a Bach concert. And that music, like for the first time hearing it, like you know you've heard it before, but maybe this is the first time you've ever really heard it. It grabs at you and you feel something larger. You feel like there's some kind of order, some kind of beauty that radiates from the universe. And for a moment, you find your unbelief fragilized and you find a moment of believing. Or another one, maybe you get word that your mother's died. You knew she was sick, but you did not think that she would die this quickly. You thought you'd be able to be home to be with her, but things took a bad turn and she's passed away. So you fly home and you're with your siblings, and your cousins, and your cousin is kind enough to let you stay at his house who lives in town, and you're there for the funeral and they're there for the burial. And the night after the funeral and the burial, you stay up late talking with your siblings and remembering your mother and talking to your cousin, and you tell stories, and you cry, and you tell more stories about your mom, and you laugh, and then you cry some more. And your brother says, remember back when Mom would clean the kitchen and she'd put on that 80s song and then she would sing into the broom and she'd sweep around. Remember when we were in high school, how embarrassed that made us? And that makes you miss your mom and it makes you cry all the harder. And you stay up too late. Well, you have an early morning flight to get back home. Well, you sleep past your alarm. You wake up, you realize you got to get to the airport. You throw all your clothes into your suitcase. You rush out to that rental car that's in your cousin's driveway. You turn on that rental car to get yourself to the airport, and you've left the radio on. And there it is. That exact same 80s song is on the radio. And Charles Taylor's point is you have a choice. You can think, oh my gosh, Jeffrey Bezos is listening to everything we say all of the time. Unplug the Alexa. turn off your phone. That's an option. In this kind of secular age, that's a viable option, and you can go on living believing such things. Or you could wonder, is there something deeper out there? Is there something at the center of the universe that cares for me? Is there a larger reality I'm called into? So it doesn't matter if we're someone who believes will have moments of that being fragilized, or someone who doesn't believe, that unbelief will have moments where that becomes fragilized. Taylor wants to say this is the conditions of what it means to live in a secular age. He says, but regardless, we inherit what he calls the immanent frame. Here's a nice picture of Charles Taylor, if you can see it. And Taylor says this, whether we're someone who believes and finds that fragilized, or someone who doesn't believe and finds that unbelief fragilized, what we all share is when we see the world through an immanent frame. And he says this, he says, the immanent frame is a constructed social space that frames our lives entirely within a natural rather than a supernatural order. It is a circumscribed space of modern social imaginary that precludes transcendence. Now, my recommendation to you is if you struggle with sleep, take a picture of this, read it a few times before bed, and you will fall into a deep, deep sleep. It has been scientifically proven that philosopher quotes have tryptophan in them, so they make you very, very, very tired. It's actually quite a profound statement, and what Taylor's ultimately saying is that every human being always has some kind of lens they see the world in. What it means to be human is always to be an interpreting creature. And we always have some kind of lens that's given to us by the institutions we live in, the society we're part of. It gives us a lens. His point is for us Westerners particularly, our lens tends to be an immanent one. If we go back to our ancestors, they tended to see the world through a transcendent or a supernatural one. We tend to see it through a natural lens. So it doesn't matter whether we believe and we find that fragilized, or we don't believe and find that unbelief fragilized, we still all share a default setting that we get from the schools we go to and things like that, that has this kind of immanent frame to it. Now, philosophers' quotes are great, but what I need are pop stars' lyrics to help this make sense. So let me show you lyrics. Don't think I'm too cool because this song is very, very old, but it illustrates my point. So this comes from the British pop star Lily Allen. A lot of you in here seem like you're big Lily Allen fans. So here's a song she had called The Fear. And you get the vibe. Lily Allen is very irreverent, very middle finger in your face, but very poppy at the same time. And in this song, if you can see this lyric at the bottom, she says, life's about film stars and less about mothers, but it doesn't matter because I'm packing plastic, and that's what makes my life so effing fantastic. All right, you get the vibe of this. Very irreverent, very in your face. But this is the lyric I really want you to see. She says, now I'm a weapon of mass consumption. It's not my fault, it's on program to function. Now here it is. She says, now I'm not a saint, but I'm not a sinner. Now everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. Now I'm not a saint, but I'm not a sinner. Now everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. This is the immanent frame. What she's essentially saying is not once, like Martin Luther, did she wake up in the middle of the night and think, am I a saint or am I a sinner? Am I bound for heaven or am I bound for hell? What does God think of me? She hasn't lost 1 minute of sleep. She has not woke up in a cold sweat wondering, is she a saint or is she a sinner? I mean, for most of the history, at least the last 500 years of the history of the West, that people cared about that. At least Northern Europeans really cared. That's why Luther came up with his symbol that we are both simultaneously saint and sinner. It's not an either or, it's a both and it was a great balm for a lot of people, all the way up until 2014 in this pop star. All right, we're not going to give her that much credit, but she does illustrate it. Not once has she lost any sleep over this. Not once has she thought, am I bound for heaven or am I bound for hell? I can't get back to sleep tonight wondering. But what's fascinating, she's lost sleep. Oh, she's woken up in a cold sweat and not been able to get the anxiety down so she could go back to sleep. It's just that its referent is not God and God's command. It is swimsuit season's coming. What are people going to think of my body? The very even object of fear and guilt becomes immanent as opposed to what we might call transcendent or divine. So she feels that in a deep way. but it's not the transcendent reality, it's the immanent reality. So our preaching, our churches, we're all filled with people who live inside the immanent frame. This becomes the great challenge, is how do we, if a big piece of the Christian life is hearing the word of a living, speaking God, how do we help our communities do that? How do we do that in the midst of this kind of secular age? So Lillian Allen does wonder that, and she has this deep existential piece. Taylor says we can't help looking over our shoulders from time to time, looking sideways, living our faith in a condition of doubt and uncertainty. And Lillian Allen says, I don't know what's right or what's real anymore. I don't know how I'm meant to feel anymore. When you think it all becomes clear, because I'm being overtaken by the fear. Now, the way we should end is I should play this song for you, right? It seems just a bit too obvious, so I don't want to play this song for you. But I do want to play a song for you, and this will be our conclusion, and then we can launch into some conversation. And it'll be a good way to launch into conversation because I'm going to give you an assignment. I want you to listen to the song. We're going to hope the audio works well. You will see the words come up of the song. And I just want you to make note of what lyric you find the most interesting, and just make note of that, and then that will lead us into conversation. Now, this song comes from a band called Purple Mountains, and this is a life hack for you to have. This is an independent band, so I do feel cool playing a song from you from an independent band. If you need a life hack, you are always the coolest person in the room if you say, I've been listening to this independent band. So you can use that at your next dinner party to get some cool points. It was a Canadian who showed me this, so I don't even deserve credit for finding the song. But the band is called Purple Mountains. The song I want to play for you is called Margaritas at the Mall. So what I want you to do is just, what lyric jumps out to you? The one thing you need to know as you listen to this is that this is written by a singer-songwriter who was not someone who ever spent any time in a church, never spent any time in a youth group, was not someone who lost their faith and longs for it again, and yet this person asked some really deep, deep questions. So what lyric jumps out to you here? All right, so turn to someone near you and just tell them what lyric jumped out to you, and then we'll have about, what do you think, Stuart, a good 10, 15 minutes for some interaction, conversation? So just debrief for just a minute or two, what lyric from that song jumped out to you? All right, does anyone want to share the word that jumped out to them, the lyric that maybe jumped out?
Stranded, that's the,
Stranded, yeah.
everything flows from stranded.
Yeah, there's a deep sense of being stranded. What does he even say? Stranded on this planet or something like that. And then he says, trotting the ground of the visible with no new word from God. how long can the world go on under no new word from God? Again, I want you to hear this isn't like someone who grew up in the church and then is wanting to get back to it. This is someone who's really lived in that kind of place of that second person I said, who finds their unbelief at times fragilized and wonders, is this enough? Is there enough here? And another way to think about the whole story Charles Taylor is telling that I've tried to synthesize for you in an hour is really the great quote unquote accomplishment of the West. You could call it a good thing or not, but it's an accomplishment nevertheless. The great accomplishment of the West is not to eliminate God in some kind of like Soviet communist way. The great accomplishment of the West is to make God quite subtle reality that celebrities like to talk about after winning Grammys, and football quarterbacks give all their thanks to, a kind of subtle force. And this young man wonders, is that enough? Is that actually enough? But what you get in replace of those old terrors of a living God doing things is what you get margaritas. You get margaritas and malls. That's what you get in place of it. But he wonders if that isn't a way of muting deeper questions that exist within us. But they come in all sorts of flavors. So before you get to the meaninglessness of it, you get a bunch of different flavors. And I do find it really quite profound how Protestantism thought the way it could only move forward, really from the mid-1980s on, was to turn our churches into malls. And remember, I told you at the very beginning, and this is where I'll turn it back to you for questions. At the very beginning, I said, if we get a wrong definition of the secular, even out of our best intentions, we may make matters worse. I think we've seen that happen, is that we think the issue is a secular two issue. How can we win participation? And what we end up doing is just giving people more immanence on top of immanence that becomes meaningless. And harder, deeper moments of doubt and fear and longing for a God who might have a word in that gets lost by thinking, how can we get more market share? The problem with the church isn't that it doesn't have enough people. The problem is, do we have any words for this young man who wonders, could God speak again? What would that mean? How would I know that? Or will all you give me is religion that's like a mall? And think that I'll come if the margaritas are going. All right, I've never known a church that had a margarita machine, because if I did, I would go to that church. But a lot of people think we just got our coffee right, we'd be good. And yet he's asking a deeper question. All right, so we'll turn it over to you, and I'll give this a start.
Do you have questions? And Cameron, is there any way to get questions for folks who are viewing on the Zoom?
We've got one question, if you're ready for it. So David is asking, is secularization not the freedom and the courage to think critically? Oh.
Yes.
Something I'm thinking about a lot lately is all this. I love healthcare. I work with poverty communities, and I always wonder, like, what does, to put it like, when you have a picture really well, what's happening to yourself?
Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot, like, what does Athens have to do with like Skid Row?
Yeah.
But like, so what do you think high ground theology like this has to do with normal people? So it's
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I'll repeat it for the Zoom folks. Thanks for the cookies. I mean, it's a question of speaking from your ministry context and thinking about working with impoverished communities. And I think you nicely said the kind of classic phrase, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? What does, now I'm going to put a bit of words in your mouth, so change that's, what does the university philosophy department have to do, hence where Charles Taylor is doing his work, what does it really have to do with people on Skid Row who are trying to make meaning in life within that? Yeah, I mean, at one level, I think it is a really good statement where we can all of a sudden get ourselves caught in these kind of intellectual journeys that take us from this concrete experience. So to avoid the heat a little bit, I'm just going to answer as Charles Taylor, and we can blame him, and you can't blame me. But I think one of the big things that he would probably particularly point to is that at a huge piece of this that undergirds all of it. And I think one of the questions you could ask on a meta level is, well, why should we care about belief at all? And I think that could be one of your points. It's like, well, it's great. Like people used to believe this in the medieval period. Now are like modernity, they believe, who cares? There are people who need to get food, and who cares? Isn't it kind of navel gazing to worry about how people believe? And that at one level could definitely be true, and it is an open critique. I think what Charles Taylor would say, and I'll just say what I would say back too, is that talking about belief here is ultimately talking about something that all human beings share, which it is a view of what it means to live a good life. And so Taylor particularly has a philosophical anthropology, a philosophical sense of what human beings are, is that human beings are always moral believing animals. So we always believe something. So to say, well, why should we care about belief is because the only way to talk about what human beings are like is to talk about what they believe. And I think one of the things he would say is that, first of all, there's people who believe things on Skid Row that we should be very interested in because they're human beings, to hear what they believe in. And secondly, would just say that we could formulate ways that we think fullness comes and it means to live well that actually becomes quite violent and dehumanizing to other people. So if we can't interrogate what we actually believe, and then this is what's really at stake for him, and this we can maybe disagree with, he's not sure that purely material views of the good will ever really lead us to care for these people. That if there isn't some kind of sense of what it means to stand responsible to, I think he would quiver at saying some divine rule or something, but he's not sure, and this is where he's a bit like Alistair McIntyre, he's not sure if we don't have some kind of tradition or view that says the least of these matter, that we will ever create a society where we care. I mean, I think that's what he would answer. So that it has a sense that we have to interrogate what we believe because it really matters for others. Now, I'm going too long with this answer, but part of I think the critique of Taylor, and do you guys do you know the name of Alistair McIntyre? Some of you do. So Alistair McIntyre was a British philosopher who kind of was a Marxist and then had a kind of conversion experience. Whereas kind of conversion experience is that the modern project itself does not have any kind of shared tradition that could actually create moral ways of being. So the whole problem with the modern project is it tries to shatter any kind of unified tradition, and that's maybe good to create a acceptable pluralistic society. But the problem with that is if we don't have any kind of shared story we hold on to, we can never create any kind of moral vision. So McIntyre's point always was modernity will never really be able to be moral. We'll never be able to really find a place for the poor because we don't have a shared tradition. And Charles Taylor was always the opposite view. No. If we actually, so McIntyre thought democracy itself, democratic liberalism cannot fulfill that. And Taylor said, no, democratic liberalism could. If we could really talk and we really could hear each other and we really could speak, we could create a space where we could take actions to make people's living conditions better and hear what it means for them to live their lives, and we could do that. Now the question is, since the 2024 election, has McIntyre been more right than Taylor? Has Taylor been too idealistic? That if we can just talk with each other, hear each other's stories, we could come to a place where we could agree on a way for us all to be mutually affirmed and have a way of life and have people not pushed out? Or is inherently within modernity, there just is not enough that holds us together, and at the end we will always exclude, dehumanize, and hurt people. So that's the really long answer to that. But yeah, you see, I answer far too long. But, yeah.
Yes.
I have a very poorly formed question, but
Yeah.
in light of your long answer, I'll try again.
Yeah.
I think we're watching that. I don't know McIntyre
Yeah.
or until today, but I think we're watching that right now in the context of a few years ago, everybody got upset. Many people got upset because we were yanking babies out of mothers' arms and sending the mothers over the border and keeping the babies over here in the ditch somewhere. This morning, we're yelling because we're sending US citizens away. Why are we sending them away? Because they don't want to be yanked out of their mama's arms. And their mama said we want to take our babies with us. So that's those two things right at each other in today's news, as far as I'm concerned. I think it does matter to me what my public officials believe.
Yeah.
I think it matters to me whether they're what I'll call Matthew 25 people, whether they want to take care of the widows and orphans or not.
Yeah.
And if they don't, I don't want them there. I don't like what they believe. I don't care how private or public they are.
Yeah, and this is that's a good word. I mean, we are at a point to talk about public-private dividing. I want you to hear me be descriptive, not normative. So I don't know if it's the best way to be. And I think it creates all sorts of problems and tensions. But in many ways, we kind of inherit this. And now we need to get past this and think about this. And I will say, America has always been a much stranger place than the rest of the West, particularly when it's up ballot. We think it really does. And maybe this is right to think. We think it really does matter what those people up ballot believe. But you talk to Germans about the American context, and they're just like, why do you care what people believe? Just you should hire, hence vote for the person that's the most competent. If they can do the competency, you can do that. So then the McIntyre response is, well, how do you define competency? You define it through some kind of tradition, some kind of moral code that's based in some kind of tradition. And we're trying to figure this out. And I do think we're just at a place where the common kind of narratives that we used to think ordered the world are not ordering the world the same way. And it is quite confusing within that. And the fascinating thing is people usually will ask me, so is there going to be a second and four? What comes after it? And I'm not, first of all, nobody like Charles Taylor would ever be a futurist and try to define what comes next. That's not the university, that's not academia. But in many ways, I'm not sure what comes next as a secular four. The question becomes, this puts another thinker with Charles Taylor and Philip Reef, is if a whole nother culture emerges. And he calls this culture four or fourth culture. In other words, this kind of culture we've had at least since the 20th century that's really actually in many ways stood opposed to authority and opposed to kind of creedal commitments of an earlier culture. So that it's mainly been a culture of critique and even deconstruction, which has had good values to it, but can it move us forward? And what will happen after that? And in the 1990s, he made kind of thoughts like, well, what will happen is that in a fourth culture, authoritarianism will come back. And maybe what will come back is a form of monasticism, where some people will have to depart. But I don't know if he's right or not, but it is a question of what happens to the order we're in these really conflicted times. And something different will come on.
Any others? Did Cameron say of anything?
I had the volume down.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm a very serious Margaret Atwood fan.
Yeah.
And after when I first read 1984, the interview said with her, she was very careful to note that she did not make up any of the major points of that book. She took them right out of the newspaper somewhere. Every single thing in there had already been written about, sometimes in a very small local press, but it had already happened.
Yeah.
She wasn't creating anything. She was just projecting what had happened thus far.
Yeah.
Here we are.
Yeah. And you know better than I do, but I know she was also thinking about how this could happen. Hey, it in some ways did happen in society, in Iranian society. That Iranian society was a quite liberal society, and then it went all the way back. So imagining that kind of Iranian revolution happening in America when there's all this, the way the religious right was talking and the way that that was becoming politicized was an interesting thought experiment for.
And
You use the word God.
Yeah.
Today. So I was just curious, what is your definition of God? Do you feel like it's God is manipulating things in the universe? Or what's your take on it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So with 2 minutes, can I give you my definition of God? Yeah, I mean, so in many ways, this is where I would see myself in some ways as a Protestant expression of what Taylor is doing. That the God that I find quite captivating is a God who does, well, it's very much comes from the Reformation tradition, is a God who speaks, a God who does act within the world in a very incarnational way, but a God who moves and acts and a God who reveals God's self. So that there is a sense, and this is a very hard thing to hold on to as a lay modern person, but this sense that there is a God who's moving history in some direction. So I do personally hold on to a sense of a personal God made known in the person of Jesus Christ, who is at work moving history towards some great fulfillment beyond this age. So I'm basically a Bonhoeffer scholar, so I hold on to really something very similar to what Bonhoeffer and Luther hold on to.
These horrible things that are happening within the world.
Mhm.
Is that within God's control?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the great question we all have to deal with is the theodicy question. And so if they are in ultimately God's responsibility and therefore God's responsibility for them to find some way to be healed or taken up and suffered by God in God's own being, and for them to be made right or healed, then it is God's responsibility. And God is responsible for that reality of healing the world. Why they happen now, I'm not sure. The only step that I can take is the pastoral response, which the pastoral response is to grieve with those who are grieved and to call out for God to act and to move and to heal in this situation. But, inside of the perspective I've been laying out here, it becomes quite a logical thing, Taylor would say. It wouldn't be a position he would take, but quite a logical position to have a very hard time believing because of the way history has unfolded. So that is, this kind of secular age makes it plausible and to hold on to something maybe that I want to confessionally hold on to, that God still moves, that God will still answer for this, that Jesus Christ, that the person of Jesus Christ suffers and bears these losses, and that there is some kind of eschatological fulfillment. But to find the burden of suffering too much to bear and for it to hold belief, Taylor thinks is a quite logical response in this context too. And this becomes part of what it means in this kind of fragilization of belief. And one of the things he says is that maybe the only way forward is how do we kind of believe again? And is that possible? And what that looks like, as opposed to holding on to some kind of dogma from the past. What does it mean to believe again? And what he would get at is that he thinks there's some kind of deep meaning in the poet. That the reduction of even suffering as having no meaning, most poets can't bear that. They also won't turn away from the absolute suffering of it, but to even try to articulate some kind of meaning in the suffering is to long for some kind of answer, some kind of inbreaking, some kind of cosmic connection, as his last book gives the title, where it really is a phenomenology of poetry. So it's an issue we can't sidestep, and yet is before us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
We
you. all.
appreciate all of you. We say goodbye to our listening audience as well and remind you that the Anderson Forum for Progressive Theology is a nonprofit corporation that does not charge for any of its services, but is quite willing to accept donations. And there's a way to do that on our website, afptonline.org. So you're welcome to find your way there and make a contribution. Thanks to Andy and to Cara, his wife, whom I saw back in the back somewhere. Thank you for all you've done for Anderson, and we wish you safe travel back to Minnesota. Okay, thank you.